The winter wind cut through Sarah's threadbare coat like claws through flesh. 3 years. 3 years since her pack had cast her out into this frozen wasteland, declaring her broken, defective, unworthy of the name Luna. The scars on her arms burned in the cold, permanent reminders of their final judgment. She pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, scanning the forest floor for anything edible, a frozen berry, an overlooked root, anything to quiet the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion. Her wolf hadn't stirred in months, retreating so deep within her that sometimes Sarah wondered if she'd imagined having one at all. The elders had been right, hadn't they? What kind of Luna couldn't shift on command? What kind of wolf shifter trembled at the sight of her own pack? She pulled her knees to her chest, the movement sending sharp pain through ribs that had never quite healed properly. The pack's final test echoed in her memory, surrounded by snarling faces, commanded to shift or face exile. Her wolf had cowered, silent, useless, so they'd marked her, scarred her, sent her into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and words that still haunted her dreams. "You are nothing, Sarah. You will always be nothing." A branch snapped somewhere behind her. Sarah's head whipped around, heart hammering against her ribs. In the distance, between the snow-laden pine branches, she caught sight of movement. Black fur, massive, impossibly massive. She scrambled to her feet, legs shaking from exhaustion and 3 years of barely adequate nutrition. The shape moved closer, and Sarah realized with growing terror that this wasn't just any wolf. This was something else entirely, something that made her broken wolf whimper and hide even deeper. The creature emerged from the tree line, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the largest wolf she'd ever seen, easily twice the size of any pack alpha. Its black fur seemed to absorb the winter light, and its eyes, golden, ancient, impossibly knowing, fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She tried to run, tried to force her battered body into motion, but 3 years of survival on scraps had left her weak, and the world tilted sideways as darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was those golden eyes watching her fall. When consciousness returned, warmth surrounded her like a cocoon. Real warmth, not the desperate huddling against tree trunks that had kept her alive these past winters. Sarah's eyes fluttered open to find herself cradled against something solid and impossibly comfortable. A heartbeat thrummed beneath her cheek, steady and strong. "Easy," a voice rumbled above her, rich and deep as mountain thunder. "You're safe." Sarah jerked upright, or tried to. Gentle hands, large, calloused, unmistakably male, steadied her before she could tumble from what she now realized was someone's lap. Someone's very warm, very protective lap. "Who?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, throat raw from cold and disuse. "My name is Marcus." The man's voice carried an accent she couldn't place, formal yet somehow intimate. "I found you collapsed in the woods. You've been unconscious for nearly an hour." Sarah's eyes focused on his face, and her breath caught all over again. This was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Strong jaw covered in dark stubble, eyes that same impossible gold she'd seen in the wolf, dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and an expression of such gentle concern that it made something deep in her chest clench with unfamiliar warmth. I can't pay you," she stammered, instinctively trying to pull away. Men who helped always wanted something in return. She'd learned that lesson early in her exile. "I don't have anything." "I'm not asking for payment." Marcus's hands remained gentle but firm, keeping her steady. "When did you last eat?" The question was so unexpected, so purely concerned, that Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. When had anyone last cared if she was hungry? She tried to remember her last real meal and came up empty. "I don't remember," she admitted in a whisper. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flash of what looked like rage quickly suppressed. He reached behind him and pulled forward a heavy wool coat. His coat, she realized, still warm from his body. Here. He wrapped it around her shoulders, with movements so careful they might have been handling spun glass. "You're shivering." She was shivering, had been shivering for so long it felt normal, but wrapped in his coat, surrounded by his scent, pine and leather, and something indefinably masculine. The trembling began to ease, and with it came something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her wolf stir for the first time in months. A golden thread seemed to unfurl in her chest, reaching toward this stranger who'd shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than she'd received in 3 years. It was impossible, ridiculous. She was broken, worthless, nothing. But the warmth spreading through her felt suspiciously like hope. "What's your name?" Marcus asked softly, as if sensing her internal struggle. "Sarah," she whispered, then immediately regretted giving him even that much. Names had power. Names could be used to track, to hurt. Sarah. The way he said it, like it was something precious rather than the label of a discarded failure, made that golden warmth in her chest flutter stronger. "It's beautiful." No one had ever called her beautiful. Not her name, not her face, not any part of her. She stared at him, searching for the lie, the mockery, the cruel twist that always came. But his golden eyes held only sincerity and something else she was afraid to name. "I should go," she said, though every instinct screamed against leaving this warmth, this safety, this impossible kindness. "In this storm?" Marcus gestured toward windows she hadn't noticed, revealing a blizzard raging beyond the glass. "You'll freeze to death before you make it 100 yards. As if summoned by his words, wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the windows with its fury. Sarah pulled his coat tighter, breathing in his scent despite herself. Part of her, the part that had kept her alive these 3 brutal years, whispered that this was a trap. Men like him didn't help women like her without expecting something in return. But another part, a part that had been silent so long she'd forgotten it existed, whispered something different. Something about golden eyes and gentle hands, and the way he'd said her name like a prayer. Marcus watched her internal struggle with infinite patience, making no move to touch her again, no demand that she stay or go. Just waiting, as if he had all the time in the world for her to decide whether she was worth saving. And for the first time in 3 years, looking into those impossibly kind golden eyes, Sarah wondered if maybe, just maybe, she might be. Dawn broke through windows that sparkled like diamonds, and Sarah woke to luxury she'd forgotten existed. Silk sheets, a mattress that didn't consist of pine needles and frozen ground, the scent of bacon drifting from somewhere beyond the bedroom door. Real food. When had she last tasted real food? She sat up slowly, Marcus's coat still wrapped around her shoulders like armour against a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The cabin around her spoke of wealth beyond anything she'd known even before her exile. Hand-carved furniture that gleamed with care. Windows that actually kept out the cold. Books lining shelves like old friends waiting to share their secrets. "You're awake." Marcus appeared in the doorway, and Sarah's breath caught all over again. In daylight, he was even more devastating. Tall enough to fill the frame completely, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of worlds, and those eyes, golden fire that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He carried a tray laden with more food than she'd seen in months. Steam rose from what looked like eggs, bacon, toast with real butter. Her stomach cramped with desperate hunger, but years of exile had taught her caution. "I can't accept this," she whispered, even as her mouth watered. "I told you, I have nothing to pay." "Sarah." The way Marcus said her name stopped her protest cold. He set the tray on the bedside table and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. Such a simple gesture, such devastating proof that this powerful man considered her worthy of his attention. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Something in his tone made her wolf stir restlessly, made that golden thread in her chest pull tighter. "I am Marcus Thorne." He paused, as if the name should mean something. "Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The world tilted sideways. Alpha King, the Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the continent, ruler of dozens of packs, legend made flesh. And he was kneeling beside her bed, offering her breakfast like she was someone who mattered. "No!" Sarah scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard. "No, that's impossible. I'm nobody. I'm broken. You are sitting in my private cabin wearing my coat, and you are the first person in decades to make my wolf feel anything other than duty." Marcus's voice carried absolute conviction. "Tell me again how you're nobody." Her wolf whimpered at the authority in his tone, but not from fear, from something else entirely, something that made her skin flush and her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with terror. "I don't understand." The words came out barely audible. Why are you being kind to me?" Marcus's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she could pull away if she chose. When she didn't, his fingertips brushed her cheek with impossible tenderness. "Because the moment I saw you, something in here—" He pressed his free hand to his chest, right over his heart. "Recognized something in you, and it's been howling ever since." The golden thread between them flared, and Sarah gasped at the sensation, like sunlight flooding a room that had been dark for years, like coming home to a place she'd never been. "I've been alone for a long time," Marcus continued, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone, ruling, fighting, making decisions that affect thousands of lives, but never sharing any of it, never having someone who understood the weight. "You're an Alpha King," Sarah breathed. "You could have anyone, any female in any pack would—" "I don't want any female." His golden eyes burned into hers. "I want the woman brave enough to survive 3 years alone in the wilderness. I want the woman whose wolf calls to mind like a song I've been waiting my whole life to hear." Before she could respond, before she could process the impossible words he was speaking, Marcus moved away to give her space. Professional distance, though she could see the effort it cost him in the tension of his shoulders. "Eat," he said gently. "Then, if you're willing, tell me about the scars on your arms. Tell me who hurt you." Sarah's hand flew instinctively to her sleeve, covering the raised marks that had never properly healed. "They're nothing, just—" "They are not nothing." The words came out with enough authority to shake the windows. Marcus visibly reined himself in, but his wolf's fury blazed in his eyes. "Someone marked you deliberately. Someone wanted you to carry their cruelty forever." She stared at him, this impossible man who looked at her scars and saw injustice instead of shame, who spoke of her survival like it was something admirable rather than the desperate scrambling it had been. "My pack," she whispered, "my former pack. They said I was defective. I couldn't shift when they commanded it, so they—" Her voice broke. "They said I needed to be marked so everyone would know what I was." Marcus went utterly still. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of deadly calm that preceded storms. "What pack?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand backed by the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah found herself answering before she could think better of it. "Shadowmere Pack, Alpha Garrett Blackwood." The names tasted like ash in her mouth. "But it doesn't matter. It's been 3 years. They've forgotten I ever existed." "They marked you." Marcus's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "They scarred you and cast you out for not shifting on command." "I am defective," Sarah said, the words automatic after years of repetition. "My wolf won't—" "Your wolf is traumatized." Marcus's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade through silk. There's a difference between defective and hurt, Sarah, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to call themselves an alpha. The conviction in his voice made that golden warmth in her chest flare brighter, made her wonder for one impossible moment if he might be right, if maybe she wasn't broken after all, just wounded. Then reality crashed back in. This was the Alpha King. This was a man who could have anyone, who ruled territories vast as countries. And she was a scarred exile who couldn't even shift properly. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I bring nothing but trouble. Everywhere I go, bad things happen. You should send me away before—" A sound made them both freeze, the distant rumble of engines, multiple engines. Marcus's head snapped toward the window, every muscle in his body going taut as a bowstring. "They found me." Sarah's voice broke on the words. "Oh God, they found me." Through the window she could see them, black SUVs winding up the mountain road toward the cabin, the Shadowmere Pack insignia gleaming on their doors like brands of ownership. "How is that possible?" Marcus moved to the window, his body shifting subtly as his wolf rose to the surface. "This location is warded, hidden. They have my scent." Sarah was already scrambling out of bed, panic clawing at her throat. "They'll track me anywhere. I have to go. I have to run before they hurt you too." But as she reached for the door, Marcus's hand closed gently around her wrist, not restraining her, simply grounding her. "No one," he said with absolute certainty, "is taking you anywhere you don't want to go, not while I draw breath." And looking into his golden eyes, blazing with protective fury and unwavering conviction, Sarah felt her wolf stir properly for the first time in 3 years. Felt it lift its head and whisper one impossible word: "Mate." The nightmares came in waves, dragging Sarah down into memories she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they weren't real. The circle of faces, snarling, demanding. The commands that fell like blows against her cowering wolf. Shift, shift now, prove your worth. In the dream, she was 17 again, standing in the centre of the pack gathering, while Alpha Garrett paced around her like a predator sizing up wounded prey. Her wolf had pressed itself so far down she could barely feel its presence, trembling with terror that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. "She's broken," someone whispered from the crowd. "Look at her. Pathetic." "Maybe pain will bring the wolf out," Garrett suggested with casual cruelty, producing the silver blade that would carve the first of many scars into her arm. Sometimes broken things just need the right motivation. Sarah jerked awake with a sob caught in her throat, Marcus's cabin materializing around her like a sanctuary after hell. Dawn light filtered through windows that had become as familiar as safety itself over the past 3 days. 3 days of kindness, 3 days of feeling almost human. But the dream clung to her like smoke, bringing with it the shame she'd carried for 6 years, the truth she'd never spoken aloud. "Hey," Marcus's voice came from the doorway, rough with sleep and concern. He'd taken to sleeping on the couch, giving her the bedroom and all the space she needed. Another kindness she didn't deserve. Another nightmare. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He approached slowly, as he always did, telegraphing his movements so she never felt trapped. When he sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipped under his weight, and that golden thread in her chest hummed with his proximity. "Tell me," he said quietly, "tell me what they did to you." The words were there, pressing against her throat like a confession that might finally set her free. But with them came the terror that once Marcus knew the truth, really knew it, he'd see her the way her pack had. Broken, worthless, defective. "I wasn't just unable to shift on command," she whispered, the words barely audible in the morning stillness. "My wolf only came out when I was hurt, really hurt. They called it trauma-induced shifting." Marcus went very still beside her. When he spoke, his voice carried carefully controlled rage. "Explain." "The first time I shifted, I was 14. 3 pack enforcers cornered me in the woods, said they were testing my reflexes. They—" Her voice broke. They kept pushing, kept hurting me, until my wolf finally surfaced to protect me. But it only lasted a few minutes before I passed out from the pain. She risked a glance at Marcus's face and immediately regretted it. His eyes blazed with fury so pure it should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel something she'd never experienced before. Protected, valued, avenged. They turned your trauma into a weapon, Marcus said, each word precise as a blade. They conditioned you to associate shifting with pain. The pack called it a useful trait, Sarah continued, unable to stop the flow of words now that they'd started. Emergency shifting, they said. Save it for when you really need it. So whenever they wanted to test me, train me, prove their dominance. She touched her scarred arms unconsciously. They'd hurt me until the wolf came out. Then they'd document how long I could maintain the shift before the trauma made me pass out. Marcus's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort of containing his wolf's rage. How long? 6 years. The admission felt like tearing out her own heart. From 14 to 20, and I let them. I thought it was normal. I thought all wolves needed pain to shift until I saw others do it effortlessly, joyfully, like breathing. That's not training, Marcus snarled, his voice carrying enough authority to shake the foundations. That's systematic torture designed to break your spirit and control your wolf. Sarah flinched at the fury in his voice, and Marcus immediately gentled his tone, though his eyes still burned with protective rage. I'm not angry at you, he clarified softly. I'm angry for you. There's a difference. The distinction hit her like a physical blow. For 6 years she'd carried the shame of her broken response, believing herself weak for not being able to shift like other wolves. But Marcus looked at her scars and saw injustice, looked at her trauma and felt fury on her behalf. It was too much, too good, too dangerous to believe. This is why I have to leave, she said desperately, scrambling out of bed and putting distance between them. Don't you see? I'm damaged goods, Marcus. I bring nothing but pain and complications. You're the Alpha King. You need someone strong, someone who can stand beside you without falling apart. You survived 6 years of systematic abuse and 3 years alone in the wilderness, Marcus countered, rising to follow her. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. It's not strength, it's stubbornness. The words exploded out of her with years of pent-up self-loathing. I'm too broken to know when to quit, too stupid to lie down and die when any sane person would have given up. Marcus moved faster than thought, crossing the room to frame her face in his hands. Not restraining her, never restraining her, but grounding her in his steady presence. You are not broken, he said with absolute conviction. You are not stupid. You are not damaged goods. You are a survivor who was failed by the very people meant to protect you. You don't understand? I understand perfectly. His thumbs traced her cheekbones with impossible tenderness. I understand that your pack committed crimes that would warrant execution in my territory. I understand that they stole years of your life and convinced you it was your fault. And I understand that despite everything they did to you, you're standing here alive and fighting, which makes you the strongest person I've ever met. The golden thread between them flared so bright it was almost painful, and Sarah felt her wolf lift its head for the second time in days. Not from trauma, not from pain, from hope. But what if I can't be what you need, she whispered. What if I can never be the kind of Luna who can shift at will, who can lead beside you without breaking down? Then we'll figure it out together, Marcus said simply. I don't need a perfect Luna, Sarah. I need you, exactly as you are. Before she could respond, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Heavy footsteps on the cabin's front porch. A fist pounding against the door with the arrogance of someone accustomed to having it opened immediately. Sarah! Alpha Garrett's voice cut through the morning like a blade. I know you're in there, girl. Come out now and we can discuss this like civilized people. Sarah's entire body began to shake, 6 years of conditioning slamming back into place. that voice, that tone of barely leashed violence disguised as reasonableness. Her wolf whimpered and tried to hide, and she hated herself for the automatic response. "I have to go to him," she whispered, moving toward the door before she'd consciously decided to. "If I don't, he'll come in anyway, and he'll hurt anyone who gets between." Marcus caught her gently around the waist, stopping her flight toward her tormentor. "No," he said with quiet authority, "you don't have to do anything." "You don't know him!" Panic clawed at Sarah's throat as Garrett's pounding grew more insistent. "He's an alpha. He's used to getting what he wants. If I don't go willingly—" "Then he'll learn what happens when someone threatens my mate," Marcus finished, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made the air in the cabin shimmer with barely leashed power. His mate. The words hit Sarah like lightning, and for a moment her wolf forgot to be afraid. For a moment it lifted its head and howled in recognition of something that felt like destiny. Then Garrett's voice came again, closer now, as if he'd pressed himself against the door. "I can smell you in there, Sarah. You and whoever you've been whoring yourself to. Come out now, and I might let him live." Marcus's entire body went rigid, his wolf rising so close to the surface that his eyes began to glow. When he looked at Sarah, she saw her own reflection in those golden depths, not the broken, scarred creature she'd believed herself to be, but someone precious enough to fight for. "Trust me," he said quietly, and it wasn't a command. It was a request, a choice offered freely, without pressure or consequence. Sarah looked toward the door, where her past waited with chains and scars and years of conditioning that whispered she was nothing. Then she looked at Marcus, who saw her trauma and called her strong, who looked at her scars and felt protective fury, who offered her a choice instead of a command. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah chose herself. "I trust you," she whispered. And Marcus smiled like she'd just given him the world. Marcus opened the cabin door with the controlled grace of a predator who knew exactly how dangerous he was. Sarah stayed behind him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, far enough to give him room to move if violence erupted. Through the doorway she could see them, Alpha Garrett and 5 enforcers, arranged in the casual formation of men accustomed to intimidating others into submission. Garrett looked exactly as she remembered, cruel mouth, cold eyes, the kind of smile that promised pain disguised as discipline. He stepped forward with the arrogance of someone who'd never been told no, his gaze sliding past Marcus to fix on Sarah with proprietary hunger. "There's my wayward little wolf," he said, voice dripping with false affection. "You've led us quite a chase, girl. 3 years in the wilderness? Impressive, really. But it's time to come home now." "She is home," Marcus replied, his voice carrying an authority that made the very air shimmer with power. "And you are trespassing on my territory." Garrett's eyes flicked to Marcus for the first time, taking in his size, his stance, the unmistakable aura of dominance that rolled off him in waves. But instead of backing down, the alpha's smile widened with predatory interest. "Marcus Thorne," he said with mock delight, "the famous Alpha King. I should have known Sarah would find a way to spread her legs for the most powerful male around. Old habits, you understand." Sarah flinched at the crude words, 6 years of conditioning making her shoulders hunch with automatic shame. But Marcus went utterly still in the way that preceded earthquakes. "Choose your next words very carefully," he said with deadly quiet. "I would hate for this to end in bloodshed." "Oh, but it won't come to that," Garrett continued, seemingly oblivious to the danger radiating from the man in front of him. "You see, Sarah belongs to the Shadowmere pack. Always has, always will. She's our property, registered and marked." He gestured dismissively at her scarred arms. "We've simply come to collect what's ours." "I don't belong to anyone," Sarah found herself saying, the words emerging stronger than she'd expected. "I was cast out, exiled. You made it very clear I was no longer pack." "Temporary punishment for a defective wolf," Garrett replied with casual cruelty. "But we've found a use for you now. The Crimson River Pack is willing to overlook your limitations. in exchange for an alliance. Alpha Cain needs a Luna, and you'll do nicely once we fix that shifting problem of yours." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She knew Alpha Cain by reputation, a sadist who'd killed 2 previous mates for failing to produce heirs. They wanted to trade her like livestock, throw her to another monster who would break her in ways Garrett never had. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, I won't go back. I won't be anyone's broodmare or political pawn." "You don't get a choice," one of the enforcers sneered. "You're damaged goods, girl. Be grateful anyone wants you at all." That was when Marcus moved, not toward the enforcers, not in attack, but backward, dropping to one knee in front of Sarah with fluid grace that spoke of absolute confidence in his own power. When he looked up at her, his golden eyes blazed with something that took her breath away. "So, Sarah Nightshade," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of absolute conviction. "I claim you as my mate before all witnesses present, not as property to be traded, not as damaged goods to be fixed, but as my equal, my partner, my queen." The world stopped spinning. Around them the enforcers shifted uneasily at the formal claiming declaration, but Sarah barely heard their mutters of disbelief. All she could see was Marcus, kneeling before her like she was something precious beyond measure, offering her not just protection, but partnership. "You can't be serious," Garrett snarled. "She's broken, Thorn, defective. She can barely shift, let alone rule beside an Alpha King." Marcus rose to his feet with lethal grace, never taking his eyes off Sarah's face. "Then you clearly don't understand what true strength looks like," he said quietly. "This woman survived 6 years of systematic abuse and 3 years alone in the wilderness. She's faced trauma that would have broken lesser wolves and emerged with her spirit intact. If that's not queen material, I don't know what is." "Pretty words," Garrett scoffed, "but words don't change genetics. She's Omega stock at best, and everyone here knows it." "Is that so?" Marcus's smile was all teeth and promise of violence. "Then perhaps you'd care to test that theory." He stepped aside, giving Sarah space while staying close enough to intervene if needed. The gesture was clear, her choice, her fight, her moment to decide who she truly was. Sarah felt the familiar fear rise in her throat, the conditioned response to shrink away from confrontation. But beneath it, something else stirred, something that had been growing stronger since the moment Marcus first called her precious. Her wolf, tired of hiding, tired of cowering, tired of letting others define her worth. "You want to see my wolf?" she asked quietly, and for the first time in her life there was no fear in the words, only determination. Garrett's grin was cruel. "Go ahead, girl. Show the Alpha King what he's really getting. But remember, pain brings out the wolf. Maybe one of my boys can help with that." He nodded to the nearest enforcer, who stepped forward with the same casual cruelty Sarah remembered from her youth. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. This time, she was chosen. The shift began not with pain, but with purpose. Sarah felt her wolf rise within her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, no longer traumatized, but triumphant. Her bones elongated without agony, her muscles reshaped themselves without screaming, and when the transformation completed, she stood before them not as the cowering creature they remembered, but as something magnificent. Her wolf was silver, pure, gleaming silver from nose to tail, with eyes that burned like molten gold. She was smaller than the males, but she carried herself with the regal bearing of something that had never truly been broken, only bent. The enforcers stumbled backward with gasps of shock. Even Garrett's cruel confidence cracked as he stared at the legend standing before him. Impossible," he breathed. "Silver wolves are myths, stories. They don't exist anymore." "They do now," Marcus said with quiet satisfaction. "Meet your future queen, gentlemen, the rarest of all our kind, and mine by choice, not force." Sarah's wolf lifted its head and howled, not with pain or trauma, but with pure, joyous recognition of its own worth. The sound echoed across the mountains like a declaration of war against every cruel word, every casual dismissal, every moment she'd been told she was less than enough. When she shifted back, naked and unashamed in the morning light, Marcus was already moving to wrap her in his coat. But this time she didn't need the shelter. This time she stood tall and met Garrett's shocked stare with the confidence of someone who finally understood her own value. "I am Sarah Nightshade," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with newfound authority. "I am a silver wolf, and I choose Marcus Thorne as my mate. I choose to stand beside him as his equal, and if you have a problem with that—" Her smile was all teeth and promise. "You can take it up with my king." Garrett's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Silver wolf or not, you still belong to—" "She belongs to no one but herself," Marcus interrupted, stepping forward with the fluid grace of barely leashed violence. "And she has chosen me. If you wish to contest that choice, I suggest you remember exactly who you're challenging." For the first time since arriving, Garrett seemed to truly see Marcus, not just as an obstacle to be removed, but as the most dangerous predator in the Northern Territories. His face went pale as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogance. "You would start a war over one broken female?" "I would end one," Marcus replied with deadly calm. "The question is whether you're foolish enough to begin it." The standoff stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, 5 enforcers against the Alpha King, with Sarah standing proud and unbroken in the space between her past and her future. She could feel the shift in power, the way the very air seemed to bend around Marcus's authority, and for the first time in her life she felt truly safe. Finally, Garrett stepped backward, his retreat disguised as tactical thinking. "This isn't finished, Thorne. The alliance with Crimson River was already agreed upon. There will be consequences." "Let them come," Marcus said with absolute confidence. "I've been Alpha King for 15 years. I'm not afraid of political manoeuvring or alliance threats, especially not from cowards who abuse their own pack members." As the Shadowmere wolves retreated toward their vehicles, tails metaphorically between their legs, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before. Victory. Not just survival, not just endurance, but actual triumph over the forces that had tried to break her. Marcus turned to her as the sound of engines faded in the distance, his golden eyes soft with pride and something deeper. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question, taking inventory of her body, her wolf, her heart. For the first time in her adult life, everything felt aligned, whole, right. "I feel like a queen," she said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. Marcus's smile could have powered the sun. "Good," he said, pulling her into his arms with the reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious. "Because that's exactly what you are." When he kissed her, gentle at first, then with growing passion as she melted against him, Sarah tasted freedom on his lips, tasted the future they would build together, carved from trust and choice rather than fear and force. She was no longer the broken exile cowering in the wilderness. She was Sarah Nightshade, Silver Wolf, chosen queen, and for the first time in her life, exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks later, Sarah woke to the scent of coffee and something that had become as essential as breathing, the feeling of being home, not just in a place, but in her own skin. The nightmares had faded to whispers, replaced by dreams of silver light and golden eyes, and hands that touched her with reverence instead of violence. She padded barefoot through the cabin, Marcus's shirt hanging loose around her thighs, and found him at the kitchen counter, reading reports with the focused intensity that marked his mornings. Territory disputes, pack politics, the endless responsibilities of ruling the Northern Territories. But when he sensed her presence, his attention shifted to her completely, as if nothing else in the world mattered. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, setting aside his paperwork to pull her into his arms. The casual endearment still made her heart skip, still felt like a miracle she was learning to accept as truth. She hummed against his chest, breathing in the scent that had become sanctuary. What time do the others arrive? Today marked another milestone in her transformation, from exile to queen. Representatives from dozens of packs were coming to the cabin for her first official audience, an opportunity for her to meet the wolves who would soon be under her protection, and for them to see that their future queen was worthy of their loyalty. Not for hours, Marcus said, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. Plenty of time for breakfast and whatever else you need. The careful way he phrased it, always checking in, always making sure she felt safe, made that golden warmth in her chest flare brighter. 3 weeks of this patient devotion had taught her the difference between being claimed and being cherished, between belonging to someone and belonging with them. "I need you to stop worrying about me," she said against his throat, feeling his chuckle rumble through his chest. "I can practically hear you thinking about all the ways this could go wrong." "Can you blame me?" Marcus pulled back to look at her face, his golden eyes serious despite the gentle smile. 6 months ago, you were convinced you were worthless. Now you're about to meet with alphas who've ruled their territories for decades. It's natural to be concerned. "I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago," Sarah reminded him, rising on her toes to kiss the worry line between his brows. "Thanks to you, I remember who I actually am." And it was true. The broken, cowering creature who'd collapsed in the snow felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place stood a woman who shifted for joy rather than trauma, who met Marcus's gaze with confidence instead of fear, who was learning to trust her own instincts about leadership and justice. The transformation hadn't been instant. There had been setbacks, moments when the old conditioning tried to reassert itself, days when she'd caught herself automatically deferring to others' judgment over her own. But Marcus had been there through all of it, patient and steady as stone, reminding her of her worth when she forgot it herself. "I know exactly who you are," Marcus said softly. "The question is whether they'll be wise enough to see it too." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the valley below, earlier than expected, but Sarah felt only calm anticipation instead of the panic that would have gripped her weeks ago. She was ready for this, ready to step into the role she'd been born for, but had taken 23 years to claim. They dressed quickly, Marcus in the formal black that marked his status as Alpha King, Sarah in a dress of midnight blue that complemented her silver hair and made her feel regal without being intimidating. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the confident woman staring back. Gone were the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. In their place stood someone who looked like she belonged beside an Alpha King. The pack representatives gathered in the cabin's main room, a carefully chosen mix of established alphas and younger leaders Marcus trusted to be fair-minded. Sarah had studied their files obsessively, learning their territories, their challenges, their histories. Knowledge was power, and she refused to walk into this meeting unprepared. "Alpha Davidson," she greeted the first arrival, a greying wolf from the Eastern Territories who'd ruled his pack for 30 years. "How are the drought relief efforts progressing in your region?" His eyebrows rose slightly at the informed question, and she saw the moment his automatic dismissal shifted into genuine interest. "Better than expected thanks to the new water access agreements. I'm impressed you're aware of our situation." "A queen's duty is to know her people's challenges," Sarah replied simply, moving on to greet Alpha Chen from the southern mountains. "Alpha Chen, congratulations on your daughter's successful Alpha trial. From what I hear, she showed remarkable leadership during the rogue incursion." One by one she worked through the gathered leaders, demonstrating not just knowledge, but genuine concern for their welfare. These weren't political pleasantries. She'd spent weeks studying their reports, understanding their needs, forming opinions about how she could support their efforts once she took her place as queen. "You've done your homework," observed Alpha Rivera, the youngest leader present, and one Sarah had been particularly nervous about meeting. But studying files is different from actually ruling. How do we know you won't crack under real pressure? The challenge was fair, expected, and Sarah appreciated the directness. You don't, she admitted freely. You have only my word that I understand the weight of the responsibility I'm asking you to trust me with. But I can tell you this. I've spent 6 years learning what it feels like to be failed by those meant to protect me. I would rather die than become the kind of leader who allows that to happen to others. Something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The careful politeness gave way to something more genuine, more real. These weren't just pack representatives anymore. They were wolves listening to someone who understood their struggles from both sides of the power dynamic. "What would you change?" asked Alpha Davidson bluntly. "If you could reform anything about how the territories are currently managed, what would it be?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the chance to articulate the vision that had been growing stronger with every passing day. "Protection for the vulnerable," she said without hesitation. Right now, wolves who can't defend themselves, the elderly, the disabled, those recovering from trauma, often fall through the cracks. Packs focus on their strongest members and leave the rest to fend for themselves. I want to establish support networks that ensure no wolf faces hardship alone. Expensive, Alpha Chen pointed out, though not dismissively. Resources are already stretched thin. Less expensive than the alternatives, Sarah countered. How much does it cost to deal with rogues created by abandonment? How much productivity do we lose when capable wolves are discarded for temporary weaknesses? Investment in support systems strengthens the entire territory. The discussion continued for hours, moving through topics ranging from inter-pack disputes to resource allocation to the growing threat of human encroachment on traditional territories. With each exchange, Sarah felt more confident in her instincts, more certain that she could handle the complexities of leadership. But it was Alpha Rivera's final question that truly tested her resolve. "What about revenge?" the young Alpha asked quietly. "Your former pack tortured you for years, then tried to trade you like livestock. Don't you want justice for what they did?" The room went silent, all eyes fixed on Sarah's face. This was the question she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the test of whether her newfound confidence came with wisdom or simply transferred cruelty. "Every day," she admitted honestly, "there are moments when I think about how satisfying it would be to watch them face consequences for their actions. But revenge and justice aren't the same thing." She looked around the room, meeting each Alpha's gaze in turn. "Justice would be ensuring that no other wolf suffers what I did. Revenge would be making them suffer in return. One builds a better future. The other just perpetuates the cycle of harm." "So you'll do nothing?" Alpha Davidson pressed. "Let them continue their practices unpunished?" "I didn't say that." Sarah's voice carried a new edge, the authority that had been growing stronger with each passing day. "I said I wouldn't pursue revenge, but if evidence emerges of ongoing abuse within the Shadowmere Pack, I will act as any queen should, swiftly and decisively to protect the innocent." Marcus's pride warmed her through their bond, and she saw the same emotion reflected in several faces around the room. This was what they'd been testing for, not just strength or knowledge, but the wisdom to wield power responsibly. As the representatives prepared to leave, each offered their formal support for her eventual coronation. But it was Alpha Rivera who surprised her with an unexpected request. "Would you consider visiting my territory next month?" she asked quietly. "We have several young wolves struggling with trauma similar to what you experienced. They could benefit from seeing someone who survived and thrived." The invitation hit Sarah harder than any formal recognition could have. To be seen not just as someone who'd overcome her past, but as someone whose experience could help others heal. It felt like the final piece of her transformation, clicking into place. "I would be honoured," she said softly. Later, after the last vehicle had disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah stood on the cabin's porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Marcus joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. "How do you feel?" he asked, echoing the question from that morning 3 weeks ago when she'd first claimed her worth. Sarah considered the day, the respect she'd earned, the confidence she'd displayed, the future she could see stretching ahead of them. "I feel ready," she said finally. "Ready for whatever comes next." Marcus's arms tightened around her, and she could feel his smile against her hair. "Good," he murmured, "because our coronation is in 2 weeks, and after that the real work begins." Coronation, their coronation. The words no longer filled her with terror, but with anticipation for the life they would build together. A partnership forged in choice rather than obligation, strengthened by trust rather than fear. "I love you," she said quietly, the words still new enough to feel like gifts. "I love you too," Marcus replied, and in his voice she heard echoes of every patient moment, every gentle touch, every time he'd chosen to see her strength when she could only see her scars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust these alphas had placed in her. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the man who'd helped her remember her own worth, Sarah felt nothing but peace. She was no longer the broken exile surviving in the wilderness. She was Sarah Nightshade, future queen, beloved mate, and finally home. The morning of the coronation dawned clear and bright, as if the very sky had dressed itself in celebration. Sarah stood before the full-length mirror in what would soon be their shared chambers, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. The gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that flowed like liquid starlight, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every breath. But it wasn't the dress that transformed her, it was the confidence that radiated from within, the certainty that she belonged exactly where she stood. "You look like a queen," Marcus said from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion and pride. He approached slowly, reverently, as if she were something too precious to be real. When he reached her, his hands settled on her shoulders with the gentle reverence that had marked every touch between them. "I feel like one," Sarah replied, and meant it with every fibre of her being. The broken, cowering creature who'd collapsed in the snow 6 months ago felt like someone from another lifetime entirely. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who had claimed her power, who was ready to rule beside the man she loved with everything she was. Through the windows she could see them gathering, hundreds of wolves from across the northern territories, come to witness the coronation of their new queen, alphas who had sworn their loyalty, families who had travelled for days to be present, young wolves who would grow up knowing that even the most broken among them could rise to greatness if they found the courage to heal. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked softly, offering her his arm with the same gallant gesture he'd used that first morning when she'd been too weak to stand on her own. "I've been ready my whole life," Sarah said, taking his arm with steady hands. "I just needed to remember how to believe in myself." The great hall of the royal estate had been transformed for the ceremony. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across stone walls, hung with banners from every pack in the territory. At the far end, 2 thrones waited, not one elevated above the other, but side by side, equals in all things. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. As they walked down the aisle together, Sarah felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Some faces showed curiosity, others respect. A few carried the scepticism she'd expected. But there was no hatred, no cruel dismissal, no one looking at her like she was something broken that needed to be discarded, just wolves acknowledging their queen. Elder Morrison, the most senior pack leader in the territories, stood waiting with the ancient crown that had adorned queens for 3 centuries. When Marcus and Sarah reached the altar, they turned to face each other, hands joined, hearts beating in perfect synchronization through their bond. "Before these witnesses," Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "I take you, Sarah Nightshade, as my mate, my partner, my equal in all things. Not because tradition demands it, but because I choose you every day, with every breath, for all the days of our lives." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of completion, of finally being seen and valued for exactly who she was. "Before these witnesses," she replied, her voice strong and clear, "I take you, Marcus Thorne, as my mate, my partner, my equal in all things. Not because I need your protection, but because together we are stronger than either of us could ever be alone." Elder Morrison stepped forward with the crown, its silver and sapphires catching the candlelight like captured stars. "By the ancient laws of our people, by the strength of your bond, and by the will of the territories you now serve, I crown you Queen Sarah Nightshade, protector of the vulnerable, defender of the innocent, voice for those who cannot speak for themselves." The crown settled on her head with surprising lightness, as if it had been made for her alone. Around them, the assembled wolves dropped to one knee in recognition of their new queen, and Sarah felt the full weight of their trust settle on her shoulders like a mantle she was finally ready to bear. But it was her first words as queen that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. "Rise," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd spent months learning to wield. "I am your queen, but I am also your servant. My crown does not elevate me above you, it binds me to you in service and protection." As the crowd rose, Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping across faces both familiar and new. "I stand before you not despite my scars, but because of them. Because I know what it means to be failed by those meant to protect you. Because I understand the difference between power that serves and power that controls." She paused, letting her words settle, feeling Marcus's pride and support flowing through their bond like liquid gold. Today marks a new era for our territories, an era where strength is measured not by dominance but by compassion, where leadership means lifting others up rather than keeping them down, where no wolf, regardless of their ability to shift, their pack status or their past mistakes, will ever be abandoned to face hardship alone. The applause that erupted was thunderous, genuine, filled with the kind of hope that transformed kingdoms. But Sarah raised a hand for silence because she wasn't finished. "I hereby establish the Sanctuary Accord," she declared, "a network of safe houses and support systems throughout our territories. Any wolf facing abuse, neglect or abandonment will have a place to go, resources to rebuild their lives, and the protection of the crown while they heal." This time the applause was accompanied by cheers, howls of approval, and the kind of collective energy that marked historical moments. Sarah felt it wash over her like a tide of acceptance, validation, and shared purpose. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration began, wolves from across the territories approached to offer their congratulations and support. Young wolves touched her hands shyly, as if her survival could somehow transfer to them. Older alphas offered resources for her new initiatives. Parents thanked her for creating a world where their children would be safer than they had been, but it was a small group of nervous teenagers who made the deepest impression. They approached hesitantly, led by a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, with the kind of careful movements that spoke of recent trauma. "Your Majesty," the girl said quietly, "we heard about the Sanctuary Accord. We wanted to ask, does that include wolves like us, ones who shift differently?" Sarah knelt to the girl's eye level, her formal gown pooling around her like water, her crown catching the light but never overshadowing the compassion in her eyes. "Especially wolves like you," she said firmly. "Different is not broken, unique is not defective, and anyone who has made you feel otherwise has never been more wrong about anything in their lives." The relief on the young faces before her was worth more than all the crowns and ceremonies in the world. This was why she'd survived, why she'd endured, why she'd learned to see her own worth so she could help others see theirs. Later, as the celebration moved into the gardens and the formal atmosphere gave way to something warmer and more genuine, Marcus found her standing beneath the stars, still wearing her crown, but having traded her ceremony gown for something more comfortable. "How does it feel?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "It feels right," Sarah said simply, leaning back against his chest, "like this is what I was always meant to do, what I was always meant to be." "Queen Sarah has a nice ring to it," Marcus murmured against her hair, "though you'll always just be my Sarah to me." "And you'll always be my Marcus," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. Not the Alpha King, not the ruler of territories, just the man who saw something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. When he kissed her this time, it was with all the tenderness of their first kiss and all the passion of lovers who knew they had forever stretching ahead of them. Around them the celebration continued, their people, their territories, their new beginning. "Where are you listening from?" Sarah asked, pulling back from the kiss with a smile that could have powered the stars. "I hope you've enjoyed this journey from broken to queen, from exile to home, from surviving to thriving. Because this is just the beginning of what's possible when we choose to see ourselves through the eyes of love rather than the lens of our wounds." She looked out at the celebration surrounding them, at the wolves who had accepted her not despite her past, but because of the strength it had given her, at the future they would build together on foundations of choice and healing rather than fear and force. "Let's meet in the comments," she continued, her voice warm with invitation, "and continue this magical journey together. After all, we're all just stories in progress, aren't we? And sometimes the most beautiful chapters are the ones that come after we've learned to rewrite our endings." In Marcus's arms, surrounded by their people, wearing a crown that had never felt heavy because it represented service rather than dominance, Queen Sarah Nightshade finally understood what it meant to be home. Not in a place, but in her own skin, in her own worth, in the love of a man who had waited for her to remember she was magnificent. She was broken no longer. She was exactly where she belonged.